Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar this morning. We're just having a technical glitch at the moment, so I would like to make some announcement for now as we wait for Dr. Quizon to come in. So first of all, we have the Corditex website, which is a very informative website on the projects and researches of the Cordillera Textile Project. We also have here a series of webinars that we have uploaded already. So if you missed the previous webinars, you can just click and listen to the recorded webinars. So we have textile conservation, stories of the Tinalak, Ifugao Textiles. We also have the one from the link of ICAT to Mexico and the Philippines. Then we have Agusan Manobo Textiles, the one in Romanian textiles, and then a series of webinars. No, so right now we have previously we had the talk by Frau Petra Martin, the curator of the Southeast Asian collections from the Dresden Ethnographic Museum in Germany. So this is also a very, very informative talk on our Philippine collections in Germany. So now we have with Dr. Cheree Quizon, we're just awaiting for her entry to the Zoom. And then we also have the Facebook page of the Corditex project, where you can also see the different activities of the Corditex. So let me just bring this up. So at the moment, we are currently having some workshops at the moment at near the Teatro Amianan at UP Baguio for the Summer Arts Festival, no, sponsored by the College of Arts and Communication. And this afternoon, there will be the third Cordillera Weaving Industry Summit, where the Corditex will also take part in explaining and participating in the discussion of Cordillera Textiles. So if you want to be posted on the activities, webinars, and lectures and publications of the Corditex, you can also check our FB page. Yeah. Okay, so we are still waiting for the our guest for this morning. So can you please hold on, and thank you for your patience. In addition, in December 3 to 6 in Baguio City at the Baguio Convention Center, we would like to take this opportunity to invite you to the sixth edition of the World ICA Textile Symposium to be held at the Baguio Convention Center. So this is a symposium with 100 textiles around the world, highlighting the Philippine ICAT, our very own Philippine ICAT from Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. This will be exhibited at the Baguio Convention and Cultural Center in Baguio City. There will be symposium, exhibition, weave exchange, fashion show from invited fashion designers from Southeast Asia and the Philippines. We also have weave workshops on ikat weaving and also natural dyeing. And of course, there will be a bazaar that will feature all of these ikat woven products, accessories and everything. So please come by, no, on December 3 to 6 to the World ICAT Textile Symposium. We also have a Facebook page, and you can also look at the previous reiteration of the World ICAT Textile Symposium from Thailand, Indonesia, London, and India. No? So it stopped during the pandemic in 2020, but they now reinstalled this, and the host will be Baguio City, the creative city under the UNESCO. So thank you, and hold on for a bit. Thank you very much for your patience. Morning.
I'm finally in.
Oh, fantastic. All right.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
so
Chair,
much
for your
for
patience.
no, I think I don't know what was going on. Pasensya na, pero finally I changed. It's my third laptop. This worked.
Okay, thank you so much, Cheree. So I just made an announcement, and so we'll just introduce you briefly to our audience. We have audience from all over. We have friends from Mindanao, from Iloilo, and then we have from the US and other guests, and also from Germany in our audience right now. So thank you for our guests, textile conservators, textile scholars, and others who are here with us right now. So we'd like to introduce Dr. Cheree Quizon briefly for this talk. So Dr. Cheree Quizon is our guest for this morning. She's a textile scholar and an anthropologist par excellence. She studies the knowledge systems and social formations relating to the textiles and dress of the Bagobo, one of several indigenous peoples of the Davao region, Mindanao in the Philippines. She has published widely on U.S. colonial era museum collections, examined through the lens of contemporary fieldwork in the origin community with comparative survey research into related traditions among the Tiboli in Lake Cebu area, Blaan in Malungun, and Matanao areas in Mandaya in Caraga area. Primarily interested in indigenous semantic categories of clothes and dress, and more recent publications on ethnobotany as well as ongoing interdisciplinary collaborations using isotope methods to study the dispersal of textile banana fiber that continues to broaden her inquiry. She is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Chairperson of the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminal Justice at the Seton Hall University in New Jersey. So without further ado, we'd like to welcome our speaker this morning, Dr. Cheree Quizon.
Thank you again, Ikin, and everyone for your patience. I'm going to try not to click too many things so that I can actually not make any more mistakes and share my slides. I'm hoping that this is visible.
Yeah. Yes, it's visible.
Okay, great. So again, let me just jump right in. First of all, many thanks to Ikin for inviting me. Ikin asked me to just talk about whatever it is that I'm doing or what I wish to talk about. So this is a different kind of, um, I guess, discussion. I hope to propose or at least present the kinds of questions that emerged from my research on Abaca in Mindanao, but to pose it as a series of queries to walk you through how questions arose in my research, and then hopefully invite ultimately some future collaboration, perhaps with Corditex, perhaps with other people in the audience. So it's framed in that way, right? It's exactly as I put it out there. I want to talk about collaborations. I want to talk about how the questions that I'm interested in, I think, can really blossom with more people working together on common questions. So the image I have on the screen comes from, as you know, the publication materials, and this is a photo from Ikin that she took of Abaca ikat cloths from the Carino collection. And I wanted to use it here because it is a really great image of a series of different kinds of Abaca ikat production coming from Mindanao. And even though we're not going to talk about, identifying per group and how they look like, I would like to call your attention to certain attributes of these cloths that are on screen. So the clear thing that everybody could see, of course, would be certain colors are very bright while certain are very muted, right? So we can easily guess which ones of these textiles make use of newer modern dyes, right? Like synthetic dyes. So those very, very bright reds near the bottom of that mandaya cloth, for instance, is very different from the less vibrant, but still recognizably red in that potentially pagobo or blaan cloth at the top of the screen. But what's also interesting to point out to everybody is that all of these are ikat. So thank you, Iken. They're all ikat. So ikat is an important part of my inquiry and my talk today, which means that the textiles are patterned through techniques wherein you tie the thread, dye it, and then weave it, right? So this is ikat, and all ikat, wherever you come from, whether it's in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, everywhere ikat is made, it's essentially made with plain weave cloth. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the third important attribute, it's much more subtle, that are all in these textiles shown in this image, is that some of them are quite shiny and some are not. Right? So we'll talk about that as well. Some have a sheen, and you'll see it with, I don't know if my little arrow is showing, but for sure, the middle cloth here where my cursor is pointing to, and then you skip this one, and then it's again here, right? You would see the sheen. It's not so visible in the top, but that's also a cloth that has a sheen, whereas this one does not, nor does this one, right? And so that's another interesting thing that I want to call to your attention, which is, I think, a special attribute of Abaca cloth that I won't normally encounter, right, in other cloth making traditions. Anyway, so let me proceed. So let's see. Hopefully, this thing works. Okay, great. So, so the first query is a query that goes back to how I ended up doing this kind of research. And the first query is encountering Abaca cloth in museums. Many of you might have already heard me talk about my work, but maybe for some of you, this is the first time. But essentially, I was a graduate student that was in search of a dissertation topic, and I was fortunate enough to have a graduate student fellowship at the Smithsonian many years ago, where I was exploring the individual poetics and patterns of collecting of American collectors, American colonial collectors, early 20th century Philippines. And I encountered the Metcalf collection, the Mrs. Elizabeth and Sarah Metcalf collection, for the first time. And you see here an image on the left of some of the tags from the Smithsonian's collection, right? And a detailed image, right, of an ikat made of abaca from the early 20th century. And you can actually also see a little bit of the sheen, right, the polish here. This, of course, led me to a sister collection of sorts at the Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology at University of Pennsylvania, also by Metcalf sisters. And of course, it leads me to other European and colonial collections, right? So Laura Watson Benedict's in the American Museum of Natural History in New York, Fee Cooper Cole, Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, right? The Light and Volkin Kunde, etc. So it kind of, and I'm sure there are people in the audience who perhaps focus on museum research, right? So it doesn't have to be textiles. I just happen to be working on textiles. But, museums are essentially libraries where we can go and learn about all kinds of questions and queries, except that in museums, the artifacts are not books, but the artifacts are the artifacts themselves. So you learn from the objects themselves. The key takeaways from doing this type of research, this anthropological research in museums, there are many, but I want to just present two, right? The importance of provenance. And by this, I don't mean individual provenance of an individual artifact, but this larger colonial era provenance, right? What does it mean when something is collected during colonial era? What does it mean when it's collected by private versus government individuals, right? What does it mean when something goes to one kind of museum versus another? So that's kind of like a larger provenance question. And both and all kinds of collections are fine. We just have to be very mindful of the provenance as we proceed using them. And then the second important takeaway is this notion of agency. So there's something whimsical, which I really enjoy, about collecting patterns of private individuals, which is what I focus on, not so much government individuals. There's been a lot of studies, for example, on Dean Worcester from Northern Luzon, right? And his role as an agent of the US government, right, in the early American colonial era. So that's got its own set of patterning, whereas private individuals who are collecting essentially for themselves have really interesting and more, you might say, variegated patterns. So that's interesting. So this notion of an agency, right? The personality, the objectives, the subjectivities, right, of people who are actually doing the collecting, writing about the artifacts that they collect, and then what they do with it, right? So whether they give it to a museum or they sell it to a museum or they keep it for themselves and then their heirs pass it on, and so on and so forth. And by the way, all the subsequent photos from this point onwards are mine unless otherwise noted. So the second query I have is Abaca cloth, not in the museum, but in the field, right? Having encountered a Bagobo Abaca cloth in the Smithsonian from 1905 to 1910, right? And deciding that that's what I want to study. Then the question is, what does it mean to study Bagobo Abaca cloth? You know, what does it mean? What does it actually mean? How do I then move on and operationalize that? On the right, you have a different image also from the Smithsonian, but this one, it's a more full-blown image of a full three-panel Abaca ikat Bagobo woman's skirt, also from the Smithsonian. And you have here the central panel, which is the black and white that has this kind of darker edging, and then the upper and lower panels, which are mirror images of each other. So the three-panel structure of a tube skirt is one of the classic kind of attributes and hallmarks that you would find among Bagobo textile weaving in the early 20th century, and is also observed in the late 20th century, and sometimes in, you know, even in more recent times, depending on whose collection you're looking at. So when you want to try to study something like Abaca cloth, no longer in the museums, but in the field, right? What does it mean? So it means that I have to think about a specific ethno-linguistic group, a culture group, or an indigenous people, or IP, as named, right? So they're named Bagobo, sometimes Tagabawa Bagobo, right? I'm also studying cloth making technology and knowledge systems, right, in the field. So it's a very, very different kind of query. Right now, I'm trying to take what I learned in the museum and I'm trying to apply that to a query that's actually in the field. So what this means is that this is standard anthropological training, right? So ethnographic fieldwork, so multi-site ethnographic fieldwork. But you see, because it's so not known at when I started this query, this was the late 1990s. You can imagine how long I've been doing this. It wasn't clear if people were still making Abaca ikat cloth. This was from 1993, right? The literature was saying, nah, there's no more of that going on. But in 1993, I don't really have any funding to do much, but I did get a pilot study from NCCA, so I was able to do a little mapping back. So the pilot survey was just to basically visit a bunch of Abaca plus ikat producing communities all over Mindanao based on what I've been told, using snowball sampling, et cetera, right? which I've covered in other publications. And then, of course, once I've done that, then I made the decision as where I would actually focus my ethnographic research on. Right. So this is like field. So not museum, but in the field. And so we have to know this is like a roughly like nearly 100 years difference. So there is no question that what I will encounter in the field is not what I will encounter in the museum. It's not possible for something to be so stable for over 100 years. It's possible, this is my understanding, it's possible to see some similarities, and I'm interested in the patterning, but I was not expecting to see, right, a stability in cloth production, because why should it, right? So, but I was curious to see if first if there was anything being done at all, and I found that there was, and what can I learn from it? But what's more important for me is the understanding after doing the pilot study that when we talk about Abaca cloth, it's not just Pagobo. It becomes very clear that it's broader, right? It's a larger distribution all over Mindanao, and not limited to the Pagobo. But there were some important differences that I saw in terms of how textiles were talked about, thought about, whether in the terms of perceptions of heritage, right? How the indigenous peoples of Mindanao, whether Bagobo, Mandaya, Bla, Antiboli, right, thought about their cloth, what they actually had still, what they were still making, what they remember but no longer have, and so on and so forth, right? So it was a very important kind of other half of the query that I was interested in. So there are many key takeaways. In fact, I would say that anybody who's done ethnographic fieldwork knows that it's very, very hard and very, very tiring, very, very complex, and very, very expensive. But then there are like a bunch of key takeaways. And so one is that, right, cloth production cannot be really thought of as just limited to a quote unquote tribe. It's not productive. It won't get you very far thinking tribally. You could understand the kinds of cloth production across different quote unquote tribes, right? Groups, ethno-linguistic groups, culture groups. But to think about it in isolation in terms of a group tribe, group style, doesn't really take you very far. This is my big insight. The second insight is that once you are in the field and learning about how people make cloth, think of cloth, then it's really not just about making cloth and thinking about cloth anymore. It's also owning it. Who owns it? Who doesn't own it? Use of cloth. Who uses it? Who doesn't use it? Theft of cloth, right? How it gets borrowed and never returned, and the kinds of social relationships that are broken because of that. And then substitution. When you don't have a particular cloth you have in mind, what do people do to substitute? So it's really, really rich and constant, right? There's a lot of shifts going on. And this was just some things I observed. Each time I went into the field, it was, new insights about making, owning, use, theft, substitution in various contexts, whether it's in the context of a private wedding, whether it's in the context of a public touristic parade, whether it's in the context of a school presentation, whether it's in the context of a municipal festival, right? Whether it's in the context of a shop or a store in a high-end tourist venue. It was fascinating to observe all of that, right? And then the last, I call these biases because that's exactly what they are. Although, we all have biases, and biases are not inherently wrong, nor can we rule them out in research. But what we can do is kind of note them and acknowledge them, right? So there was a great deal of art bias in my questions, right? Initial questions asking about motifs and finding that the weavers are less interested in motifs. I was interested in them, but they weren't. They found the question weird. Instead, they wanted to talk about counts, right? Numbers. So, I've talked about that in my work. So some of you who might have read my work would have learned more about that. And then observational bias in the sense that we tend to enter the field thinking, oh, what do I see? Oh, if I don't see it, it must be dead. It's no longer there. Oh, poor indigenous peoples, they don't have any more of their culture. It's so damaged, etc., etc. Right? That kind of bias. We're so arrogant that just by visiting it like 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 times, we know, until you get into conversations and you realize that even though folks might not have the cloths in their possession, there is inside their heads this ideological and phenomenological superstructure, right, that understands categories of cloth and what they're for and what they mean, right? That can be elicited through photographs, right? But again, not everyone. Why should it? It's a specialist. It's a specialist field, right? Even within communities. So observation of, and then also learning about things that I didn't observe but was reported to me afterwards, or was mentioned to me in by accident when I'm no longer doing proper research, but just kind of sharing meals, right, informally. So this observational bias, right, there are lots of things we could not and would not, and inevitably are very difficult to observe, right, but are just reported to us, or we have to infer them. And then speech bias, right? I entered the field as a Filipino from Luzon, raised with a Tagalog mother and Kapampangan father, has a verbal comprehension of Cebuano but did not speak it, entered a field where the lingua franca is Cebuano. In the first with the Cebuano translator, and the second and third instances with the Bagobo translator, and finding amazing shifts depending on what language is being used for interaction and elicitation, and how you, the interlocutor, is perceived, right? And I've written about this, right? This notion of how indigenous peoples actually kind of try to meet halfway by using terms that they believe I understood, right? Such as costume, when they're talking to me. But amongst themselves, it would be umbak. And then finally, heritage bias, wherein again, right, we have, this is something that I know I carry in me because, I grew up in the Philippines, I'm from Manila, and I admire indigenous cultures of my own country, right? But there is also this tendency to say, oh, that heritage bias, we tend to think of heritage as something that is to be preserved, something that, is fragile. It's something that we have to mourn when it's gone, when instead of thinking of heritage as something that actually supports the needs of people who are living today, right? So how do people today interpret their own heritage? And how does that look like? Is it like our own perception of heritage, right? So when, let's say, certain artifacts are taken from a source community because it's going to be memorialized, let's say, in a museum in Manila, right? What does it mean to take stuff away from the community, right? It's because you're protecting the community from themselves, right? That they think that they won't be able to take care of it. Is it because you think that it might get stolen and therefore you're the caretaker? How did that happen? How did those decisions get made? Whose heritage, right? So those are the kinds of new questions that came up, or at least it complicated the thinking about this. I'm not the first to raise this. It's something that's raised by many people who do these kinds of research, right? In communities that are perceived to have a more robust relationship with tradition as opposed to modernity. So I have here on the right, for example, an image that I took from Tagabao-Bagobo family collections in 1994. And, unlike the previous image of the red, white, and black Abaca ikat that we're quite used to seeing, here is one that uses pink and green on Abaca cloth, right? This was in a private family collection, so it was commissioned. They wanted it to be pink and green, and there you go. So it means that there is really, a great deal of interest. It's still very recognizably a Tagabao Bagobo. Sorry, it's got the mother piece here in the middle, right? And it's got um, the child pieces on the other side, and you still see, right, the very clear central panel, but it's synthetic dyes in 1994 for individual private family use, not for sale to tourists, right? So, yeah, it kind of shakes up some of your assumptions, right, about what that means. So, having done the museum and having done the field query, there's another query now that, as we're all scholars, right, we have to think of queries that kind of also exceed our brief, right? We have to think more widely and broadly. So then the question is, how do we think about Abaca cloth in the region? And I discovered as I was thinking about it that it's actually two regions, because I'm looking at Abaca as a cloth, but it's also Abaca that's patterned with ikat, right? And for many of you in the audience who are familiar with ikat, such as in Northern Luzon, right? As opposed to, let's say, cloth from Northern Luzon that's not ikated, but instead patterned through other methods such as supplementary weft or supplementary warp, right? Or embroidery or, some other embellishments. You are very aware of how different that kind of knowledge system is, and the kinds of skills that are involved, and the kinds of steps and the kinds of specializations that become important, right? So to think about Abaca cloth in the so-called region, right? There are actually two regions, right? So Abaca cloth, so when I mean by Abaca region, my question is, where else is Abaca or Musa textilis, which is the scientific name of Abaca, or related banana species such as Musa balbisiana, for example, used for weaving cloth on the loom? So very, very specific. Where else is Abaca or banana fiber used for weaving cloth on the loom, right? And then for the Ikat region, the question I have is, well, where else is black and white and red Ikat technique practiced, right? So where else is there Ikat cloth that looks like what is made in Mindanao? Even if it's not identical, it looks like it because it's got the same color palette as well as warp ikat, because ikat is pretty much just warp, not the weft. So the Abaca region is actually wide ranging. It's all of the Philippines, everywhere in the Philippines. Abaca is woven on the loom, but it's also woven in southern Japan, in Western Pacific, and the Sangihe Islands in Indonesia. Right. And there I have an example of cloth, banana fiber cloth from Okinawa, right, from the Okinawa Convention and Visitors Bureau. And you can see that they use a variety of cloth. So indigo, right, and at the same time some bright yellows and reds, right? So it's there's certainly a lot of innovation that's happening everywhere, right? But then where else is black, white, red ikat technique practice? So the kinds of cloth that, if you only looked at pictures, stylistically we would say, oh, that's related, right? And this whole ikat region would be, of course, just Mindanao. I'm talking about black, white, and red, right? I know that there's ikat, of course, in Northern Luzon, but it's this very tight use of, black, white being the color of Abaca, and red as a or red brown as the palette, right? So we see it in Mindanao, we see it in Borneo, Kalimantan, Ibang Dayak, depending on whether in Malaysia or Indonesian side, right? We see it in Flores and the other Indonesian islands, and we see it in Sulawesi, right? So but it's not Abaca, it's cotton, but it's similar, right? So I found this image, right? And I kid you not, it's called Flores Ikat Cushion. Right? It's on Amazon. But that's a good example of how, this is a cotton cloth made into a cushion cover that shows you the indigo black, right? And then you have the Morinda red on cotton that comes from Flores, right? So it's really, you can immediately see the similarity in terms of being part of what I call the Ica region. So the region is actually two regions, right? And so that's part of the query. So then the question is, and then of course, I'll bring this up again later, but one of the interesting insights is that where else in the world is there an overlap of abaca and ikat, or banana fiber and ikat? And surprisingly, from as far as I can see, I haven't seen anything that tells me to the contrary. It's really Mindanao only, parts of Mindanao, not all, and only southern Japan. And even though southern Japan and Mindanao share banana and ikat, stylistically, the Japan stuff is very, very different when you look at it. But in terms of this notion of fiber and pattern, it's only these two places. So very interesting, I think. So with those initial queries, there are, of course, a bunch of secondary queries, many, many secondary queries. Right? Sorry, I should go back. So these are just a sampling. I present three, right? So one of them is I observed that certain groups in Mindanao, Bagobo, Bla, Antiboli, once they're done weaving with an Abaca cloth, Abaca ikat cloth, or even Abaca not ikated cloth, they polish it with wax. It's a very, very specific process, but not the mandaya. That's why I bring back to the first slide, right? Some of those rolls of cloth were not shiny. And that's one of the easiest way to say, oh, that's mandaya. It's not shiny, it's not that. Why? Because clearly it's not important to the people that make it, right? The mandaya do not seek the shine. They seek something else. Whereas the Bagobo Bla Antiboli seek the shine, except the Bagobo Bla Antiboli, right, have very different ideologies with polishing, right? So some are more hardcore than others, but still that there's this interest in polishing. So the question, why? Another query that arises, right? And I point you back to that cushion from Flores, right? So black dye in cotton ikat uses indigo in northern Luzon and eastern Indonesia and Borneo, Kalimantan, and Sulawesi, but not in Abaca ikat in Mindanao. Right? Abaca ikat in Mindanao doesn't use indigo at all. They use a dye from a tree, a hardwood tree, Diospyros nitida, even though the word for black in most of these communities tend to be variations of the word that we should be able to link to indigos is very intriguing, right? Why they don't use indigo? They don't talk about using indigo, but instead if they use indigo in the past, perhaps, but at least 100 years ago, it was not reported to be used by them. So why? And then the third query, again, a sample query, right? Which I mentioned before, why is the combination of banana fiber and ikat only in Mindanao and southern Japan, right? So some of these questions are farther along than others. Some of them I've pursued, some are not. But it's clear that many of these questions are really better pursued through a collaboration of people, right? Historians, right? Philologists, if you are from the European tradition, right? Chemists, right? Environmentalists, art historians. It's when you have these types of queries, right? It really exceeds a discipline. Even though anthropology is very interdisciplinary, right? It does exceed my training in the discipline. So I have some intermediate queries and some examples of my collaborations, right? So for the question about, the dyes, one of the intermediate queries was to try to then document and report what they do use, right, for dyes and dye sources. So I've published on this with my collaborator, Fem Baguio from Ateneo de Davao, now retired. But she was so instrumental in helping me think about this because I'm not a botanist, right? And she studied many, many things, including she's actually a specialist on flies, but she also studied a lot of plants, right? Especially indigenous people's plant use in Mindanao. And so she was just having many conversations with me and helped me think things through. So that's one. It's not the answer, but it's a way towards an answer by at least determining certain things. And then the other thing is that I teach in an institution that's only undergrad. There's no graduate program. And so I just try to work with undergrad students who are interested in certain questions. So I got one of my students. She was actually a biochem major, from, she's Indian American, but she was interested in this work, and so she fooled around with a photospectrometer and published this work in our undergraduate research journal. I gave her the textiles in my collection for her to study. And you see here an image on the right, some of the things that she's trying to do, because I myself don't know photospectrometry. So she was basically taking the lead, right, in helping me understand, everything from cinema, right, to, different kinds of ikat, whether they were wax, such as what you have here, right, or those that are not wax. And then I have an ongoing collaboration right now with archaeologists. So I'm very excited about that. It's still going on. It's a bit slow because we don't have funding. We're doing it on the cheap. But we have this textile banana isotope-based analysis project. We call it the Textile Banana Project. Basically, Anna Pineda introduced me to Celine Kerfant, who introduced me to Saskia Ryan. And so we basically did all these collaborations. It has led to a conference paper that you see here on the bottom right that was presented at the Indo-Pacific Archaeology Conference in November 2022. It was Anna that read the paper on behalf of all of us. And the image you see on the screen is actually an ArcGIS story map that I got another one of our undergrads to build for us. So I gave her the data and the photos and images, and she kind of built it. And so this is another screenshot from the ArcGIS story map that she built. I mean, I can click on the link here and take you to her story map, but I don't know if I have enough time for that. But I just, wanted to show you that this is what she did for us. And here, she created this map that showed it's a preliminary study we have where we have like basically 7 samples that we were doing preliminary isotope analysis in. And that's what we're doing now, and hopefully publish that. Well, the objective is to publish it by the end of the year, so we'll see, right? And then, of course, future collaborations in cotton. I'm thinking of all the people in the room, many of whom must be working in the Cordillera, therefore cotton. So, I'm hoping that you can, hear my call. I'm trying to educate myself about cotton because, it's been a lifetime of just thinking about Abaca. So I'm reading lots and lots of books, but I'm reading 2 books this summer, both of them from Bloomsbury. A new one on Turkey Red by Julie Wirtz on the left, and an older one on cotton by Beverly Lemire. And what I'm learning as I'm reading about them would be things like the biochemistry of cotton, right? And how Turkey Red came about and how to define Turkey Red from Julie Wirtz. And I'm also learning about something called cotton cultures, right? There's a culture around the use of cotton as opposed to the use of Abaca. So there are really cultures, right? Patterns of doing things and thinking about things that are shaped by the materials. So that's, if the people out there are thinking about cotton textiles in your area of specialization as well, in this more kind of abstract, super local way, maybe there's stuff for us to collaborate on. And now I did some explorations on the Corditex website, since Ikin invited me, and she mentioned this to me too, even before, but I just did a little bit of exploration. And I saw that there was a lot of work being done on weave structure. So as I mentioned before, as you know, Abaca ikat, as shown here in this magnificent, like another example of a 3-panel piece here, you see it here, right? It's actually a plain weave. Right? But there's so much supplementary weft, especially in Luzon, but not just limited to Luzon. There's other parts of, for example, among the Yakan of Basilan, right? There's lots of supplementary weft going on there. So, what kind of insights, right? I haven't seen supplementary weft in Abaca. I don't think it succeeds so well unless there are others wherein there is a mixture of use cotton and Abaca. There's been that kind, but not all Abaca. So interesting questions there. This other image I have here on the extreme right, is a detail of a different kind of cloth. which I haven't seen among the Mandaya or the Blan or Tigoli, but I've certainly seen it among the Bagobo. And it's a twill weave. And so I'm thinking, right, this is not an ikat at all. It's basically through the patterning is through the weave structure. So maybe twill weave stripe bagobo cloth, right? And the Corditex digital loom initiatives, right, might have something to say there, because needless to say, this is actually very hard to find now. A few people claim, even the weavers I interviewed, few of them um, said that they could do this twill weave. Bagobo call it tuatalian, right? So I have here just some, images under magnification to just kind of show you how that looks like. So above you have a red dyed plain weave warp face abaca. So under magnification, it's very, very clear what we mean by warp face, right? You see, right, that this cloth is mostly, right, the warp threads, and you see those thick weft in between, right? And then below, but that's at the end, this is still a plain weave, even though it looks textured because of the difference, right, in the fineness of the warp and the weft cloth. That's threads, which is why makes it's a warp face. And here below, you have my example under magnification of this twill weave, right? So here's the black and white section here, which look like, if you zoom out a bit, they would look like little diamonds. Sometimes they're called little eyes, bird's eyes, right? This is the white on the black field, but you'll know that it's not a plain weave because at the back you see how it looks. This is exactly the reverse of this cloth under magnification, right? So it's very, very different structure, very complex structure. I don't know if there is twill weave in other parts of the place, but I thought that might be exciting, right, for Corditex, because of the textile structure. Anyway, so I just wanted to end this talk by showing you some more images under magnification that kind of, they kind of excite me, and uh, and I'm hoping that it could lead to more queries, right? So none of this, of course, deals with isotope, which is what I'm doing right now with my banana collaborators. But this is more like stuff that I did on my own. I went back to the Smithsonian in 2019 and revisited textiles I already studied from, a decade earlier or more, and went back and took magnified images. And it shows you here on the extreme left, right, what happens when a Abaca cloth is polished. So you see here on the upper image, right, the flattening of the fibers, so much so that they have this kind of strange shape, right? This kind of like wheat shape. The one at the bottom is another cloth, but it's not the same one. But you can see that this cloth at the bottom is not as polished as the one on top. So this can be done through a lot of pressure, right? Through the shell polishing technique, as well as the use of wax to make it very shiny. So you see the difference when it's less polished. So you could have physical properties that can be observed fairly easily, and these are non-destructive properties. In the middle is my forays into cotton, right? So what you have here on the upper image, and I didn't really think about this too much until somebody who studies Japanese shibori asked to talk to me. And it's the folks from the Shibori Institute. And when we had this conversation, I got very excited too about this type of resist. So it's tie-dye, right? It's a tie-dye circle that I look at under magnification, red and white on cotton, right? Completely different chemistry from Abaca, completely different dyeing. And here is, plain undyed cotton under magnification, right? Very, very different. My question would be, can you tell me if I can identify hand spun versus commercial spun or machine spun cotton just by inspection? I don't know. I would love to be able to answer that. So that's tie-dyed and plain cotton. And then here we have an image of what in Indonesian is called tritik, right? You sew a design into a baka fiber very tightly, then dye it and remove the threads. So you even still see the holes where the thread was, right? And then here in greater magnification, how the resist looks like, right? This interesting fade, right, that happens. So I thought that might be like a, just looking at this, there are all kinds of interesting questions that can be asked that we can use to learn about textile production and related, right, practices in the past. So that's what I wanted to end with, just to show you, just to throw out there, right, some of the possible things. I think that a lot of us sit on a lot of data, and it would be really great to kind of pick at all that and see what kinds of questions we can ask of our data and maybe come up with new insights. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing. Iken, should I do that?
Okay, thank you. All right. So thank you so much, Cheree, for that fascinating talk. I learned so much, and I have a lot of questions actually. So meantime, we'll now ask our participants. You can type in your questions in the chat box if you have some questions. Meantime, I have the presentation is really very wanting to have a collaboration with Corditex, Cheree, because we are also doing the same I mean the process and understanding. We have the Corditex is a team of interdisciplinary scholars. We have physics, chemistry, also working on natural dyes. We are also working with ethnomathematicians, yeah, and ethnobotanists as well. So definitely we should collaborate. Okay. So meantime, I have some questions here. Very much intrigued with the materials and the process used from your work. And we just did a reconnaissance in Mindanao last month. And we found the materials and the techniques quite different from maybe 100 years ago to the present. So there's a change in the ecosystem already with the Abaca, the source, no? So what do you think about this? Since it is now very scarce in terms of the production of abaca to be used for weaving by these groups in Mindanao, the Blaan, Tiboli, and others. So can you comment on this? Because it also has a same problem in northern Luzon, the scarcity of cotton used for weaving. And maybe
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a great question, Iken. So the scarcity of abaca is I guess it's also nothing new, right? There was at some point, for some, there might be historians in the room, there was a real die-off, right, through the mosaic virus, right? So there was this really a whole series of times in the past where abaca became really difficult to obtain, both the industrial as well as the ones that are used for weaving, right? But what I found for small scale producers, this would be the weavers that actually managed to stay active because they actually liked weaving, right? And they had the knowledge for it. Um, the weavers would always say to me, we can't weave if there's war. We can't weave if they're a helicopter gunships, right? We can't weave if those things are happening. But if there's times of peace, we can weave, right? So even though there's a desire to weave, they won't be able to do that. But if they do manage to do that and find a way, what I noticed is that there are actually very long distance networks of family as well as family adjacent um, members of the community that really traverse very large distances across provinces. And so all the weaver has to do is say, I need this, right?
yeah,
Can you find it for me? And so the networks kind of kick in, right? And so, for example, so even though there is a lot of you know what do you call this, degradation of the immediate environments, let's say for abaca, right? It's still possible though that there's still a lot of robust, let's say, morinda, which is the red source of dye. So that might not be affected similarly. But if they do, I know that in many communities, there's still a great deal of craft production of abaca for the market. So especially in Sarangani, right? We find this as well as, of course, in Davao Oriental. So there are all these different pockets that still engage in household scale fiber prep that's then sold to the market. And it's those same folks that are knowledgeable enough to know what a weaver requires, which is a different variety. There's a question in the chat actually about that. And so they talk about first class. So they have terms for it, maputi, which means white, right? Very, very white. And so they talk about a very specific class that's used for the warp. For the weft, it's rougher, but for the warp. So maybe I'm too optimistic, but I tend to say, I leave it to the weaver and say, this is, let's say, if I would commission, which is what I did. I said, let me commission something. I leave it to you. You find your own sources, right? So the knowledgeable weaver, usually a much more senior weaver, has really, really vast connections that then they kind of activate, right? What they do need, though, is money, because they have to send a young relative to go and travel and blah and blee, right? And find out all about that. So is it not as nice as before? Sure. Is it impossible? I don't think so. I think that it can be done. However, the pace of production cannot be the pace of production we expect from, let's say, a commercial venture, right? This types of weaving is high art weaving. So the way we should approach it is really dealing with somebody who you're commissioning to make a portrait, right? That type, right? It's that scale, it's that range. And so there are networks, they can solve problems, but you need to really essentially entrust it, right, to the people who are creating it, and to give them time. What also happens is that knowledge is not even. So we tend to ask, oh, why don't you know your own culture, right? There's this whole judgy dynamic that happens, right? If people ask me about all aspects of Filipino culture, I can't answer all of them. I'm knowledgeable more than most because I'm a college professor, but still, there are aspects about my Pampanga side, for example, or my Laguna side that I have no clue about, right? And what would I do? I would ask, right? Members of my family. So it's we have to kind of respect the dynamic also of how knowledge gets shared and transmitted. So I guess you would say that I am optimistic. I may be wrong, but I believe that gently does it. It's possible. But it's true that with the death of specialists, right, a lot goes away. And so the efforts you make, right, to try to revitalize this is actually fantastic, I think. And I hope that giving these talks also, right, raise awareness and raise consciousness. I would love ordinary members of the public, right, to just have a more, I would say, normal relationship, right, with indigenous
Mm.
cultural production, instead of this weird hyper heritage whatever that actually I think conceals the more important question of us seeking to know more, right, about our own past and present. So long-winded answer. I hope it answered your
Yes.
question.
There's a question from Gilbert Marine from Iloilo. He is a provincial tourism officer of Iloilo and an advocate of handloom weaving. He would like to ask regarding the use of abaca for handloom weaving. Iloilo has a very rich weaving history, and weaving abaca is a dying practice. So they have many towns producing abaca, and he would like to know if there is a specific type or class that is good for weaving. And how about the rejects? She knows that some abaca turn dark in color. Can they be used in handloom weaving? And he said, thank you for the presentation.
Yep. So in answer to that part about the class of abaca, I think I mentioned it, right? There's different classes. I think they would say first, second, third, right? There from the market, they have a different way of classifying. But for weavers, it's a certain variety, as well as a certain part of the plant. So they need a variety of the plant that when you strip it, it's very long, right? So it's very specific. I think many of them would for this tanggungon, but there are other varieties, right? So it has to be nice and long because you have to make it into thread, right? So you want them longer than rather than shorter. And then the class, of course, it would be the certain parts of it that are not the external, but the more internal, which would be the wider part. The question though is that, what do you want to make with it? It's so labor intensive to turn Abaca into thread because it's connected by hand, right? End to end, that it's actually in the end very expensive in terms of human hours, right? As well as material itself. And so if you use all of these human hours to create thread, what do you make with it? Right. Now, granted, we have been making Abaca woven things as a country forever. In fact, Abaca is endemic to Luzon, right, into the Philippines. So we make them into fishnets, into baskets, into chinelas, right, into raincoats, right? So it's not as if it's not something we're familiar with. But in today's day and age, if you are going to engage in this kind of production and you end up making, let's say, I don't know, placemats, right, or coasters, right, the amount of money you can charge for those products in relation to the amount of time that went in them might not work out in the end because you can't really charge very much, right? For especially if you have a Abaca like production of handicrafts in many parts of the world. So I would say that just be very mindful of that. The processing itself is quite expensive and requires a great deal of skill. Regarding your question about um, the dark parts and whether they can be used. So the rough parts can be used, or thicker parts, less fine, can be used for the weft, right? As opposed to the fine ones for the warp. That's for cloth weaving. But it's actually made in all kinds of other things, like rope, right? So the thick ones are made into rope. They can be part of salakot, right? So these hats, right? They're used in many industrial uses. To this day, it's a very handy. I mean, we know about the Butuan boats, right? They're essentially sewn together with Abaca or an Abaca, like I believe it's Abaca, right? Because Abaca retains its strength in water, right? It doesn't degrade in water. So there are many uses. In fact, just our history is full of their various uses. Today, there is, I think, an export market in fine cinamay for hat production, for example, in Europe. And but that's a very old market. Hats made in the 19th century, right? In Britain, even today, worn by the royals, right? If you look closely, many of them are basically cinamay, but they're not necessarily all coming from the Philippines. But there is that use for that. In that case, for that variety and that quality, it might be higher, right? Or might have a more of a positive impact for the community when it's intended to produce livelihood, for example, because I'm assuming that that's part of the query. Deacon, you're muted.
There's another follow-up from Gilbert. What is best used to dye abaca fibers? Will synthetic dye last? Because one of your slides showed that using synthetic dyes.
Yes, I think they've been experimenting with synthetic dyes forever, no? But one thing to keep in mind is that the kinds of garments that for sure the pagobo and the blaan make, which are very special ceremonial garments, right? These skirts, they're not really washed. They're essentially dry cleaned as in not cleaned by water and soap, right? The polishing is the dry cleaning, right? So there's different grades that could be used for every day, but the really the best kinds, right, are not really washed. So fastness is not as right crucial in that sense of washing, but fastness in terms of sunshine, not fading it, is important. And fastness also in terms of the beauty of the color not going away or fading over time is the desirable one. So synthetics, yes, experimentation is rife. It keeps happening. You see it either as little insets in Abaca cloth production or entire sections And one of my, I think I published about this, one of my early encounters was with a Mandaya weaver at the Insular Hotel in Davao many, many years ago, asking her about the color. And she was telling me that it was purple. And I was writing it down thinking purple was a color. And then it was actually purple, right? The color purple. And she was very proud of the fact she was using purple, right? So experimentation, I think, is key, but lots of folks have actually done a lot of experimentation. I know that there are some Tiboli entrepreneurs doing high fashion experimentation and using brilliant synthetic colors, right? For purses, for balabal, right? All kinds of interesting things. And so yes, and I think it's kind of fun to play with, right? Because it's such a versatile material.
Thank you, Cheree. I have a very itching question right now because you talked about the Abaca region and the Ikat region. And for these groups near the Matutum mountain, the Blaan, Tiboli, Bagobo, Tagabawa, use same color, same material, same technique. But if you go down Maguindanao and Marawi area, there's also an ikat tradition. So there's Abaca on the other side of the mountain, and you have this in the northern part using silk and cotton, but that's already lost. So in terms of comparison ethnographically or anthropologically, what are the major differences of these two aside from its material?
That's a great question. The Maguindanao, you're right there, and the Maranao, no, there certainly is ikat production there. The best insight I could think of is a comment made to me by a colleague of mine from UP Diliman, Abi Sakili, who is Tausug, right?
Mhm.
And he said to me, you know, Cheree, in among the Tausug, when we say dagmay, which is the term that's the Mandaya used to refer to Abaca cloth, right? Says when you say dagmay, it's considered an inferior cloth. So for them, it's like a low category of cloth, no? Why? Because it's seen as rough, right? And it's seen as not refined. Whereas the desirable cloth, of course, is silk.
Yeah.
And if you can't get silk, it would be cotton. No? So there's a hierarchy of fiber. But did the Maguindanao or Maranao in the past make use of abaca for ikat? Most likely, yes, right? I believe that there is sufficient evidence to show that it has been used in the past because the technique is identical, right? It's warp ikat that seems to be transferable. Now, how the Maguindanao and the Maranao solve the chemistry of that, right? I don't know. I would defer to my colleagues who do research in Maguindanao and Maranao textiles. But yes, for sure. Now, what did they use when they were just using abaca, right? I Because of my research, I depend so much on well provenance collections. So I haven't looked into collectors working around that time who I can say reliably documented where they got which pieces where. So I can't give you a confident timeline, but I'm sure it can be done, right? So if folks want to work, and especially with Maguindanao Maranao, there's lots and lots of stuff collected because of all the American military activity in these
Yes.
areas, right? So there's a lot of work that can be done there. For us to be able to say, what's our earliest example, right? A documented example, what they actually use. I am confident it can be done.
Mhm.
But right now, from my own data, I don't have the data. But there's every indicator that yes, that for sure the red, black, white in Abaca would have been present, right,
Mm.
among Maguindanao and Mindanao. Now, the important thing to keep in mind, though, because they're Maranao and Maguindanao, right, as well as the Tausug, is their intricate trade relations. So because of that, there was much more import textiles coming in from abroad, right, especially from India, right, as well as China. So this really impacted um, cloth use in cloth production. So weavers are very creative. So they see things and they know how to copy. They know how to make a version of it. And they also experiment. At some point, there's a shift towards the preference for a thread that isn't Abaca. For one thing, you don't have to do the tying. However, buying ready-made shop thread is expensive. So it becomes a symbol also of wealth, right? That you can actually afford this. I did relatively recently work on these wonderful painted Abaca tapestries. I found them in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. It was actually Nina Capistrano Baker who pointed me in that direction, and I went there. And so there were these massive Abaca, plain Abaca cloth that's been painted, right, with designs that they almost look like they're carpets, Persian carpets, right? But the painting is red, white, and black. So the color palette of these large textile panels that were used to hang inside, I believe they're Maranao houses, right? Were the same palette, red, white, and black, right? So that I thought that was interesting. I
Yeah,
hope that
fascinating.
answers your question.
Yes. Well, on the overview of ikat tradition in the Philippines, we know that in northern Luzon there's ikat. They use cotton and indigo, and then of course Mindanao, Abaca, and these various dye-yielding plants. But when you look at Visayas, and you mentioned about working with archaeologists, have you explored research on the Banton cloth, which is also an ikat extinct ikat tradition in that area?
Well, the Banton cloth, I was fortunate enough to be able to study it. When was that? Many decades ago, at the National Museum in situ. The Banton has like there are three pieces actually. So one I was able to study in the archaeological collection. One was actually on display, so I just took photographs of that. So the only study I could do was inspection, right? And so by inspection, by looking at the physical properties of the weave, I'm pretty sure it's banana fiber, right? Although to be really, really sure, you have to engage in destructive techniques, but I don't think anybody's interested in destroying any part of the baton textile at the moment, which is why I'm very interested in photospectroscopy and all of these non-destructive techniques, right? Can I infer certain things about the Banton cloth? I guess you could say my interest in the isotope project is partly to try to answer something about the Banton that one day in the future we can actually ask if the banana fibers, assuming it's banana, like it's a very big assumption. Okay, I'm very conservative, so I'm thinking it's a big guess. It's banana fiber, but I won't say so until right. Sure, but it by all intents and purposes, stylistically, morphologically, it's basically classically a bakaikat, right? Red, white, and black. But the question would be if it's found in Banton, in the Romblon group, did they grow the abaca there? So that's a question I don't know, right? If it was grown there, right, then that answers a lot of things. But if it was grown elsewhere, it could still have been woven there, right? So the question is, where was the fiber from? And then the second question is it Morinda, which is the source of red for abaca, and is the black, right, Diospyros nitida as the source of black? I don't know. From inspection, it looks consistent, right, in terms of color and range, but I don't know. And because we don't engage in destructive analysis, right, it's very hard to know. However, from just right the range of the coloring, especially for the one in the archaeology collection, which is what I was able to study right in greater depth, it's consistent. The ikat pattern is also a different data set, right?
Yes.
So the icutting of the cloths are actually distinct. So the one in the archaeological collection has more stripy, very narrow ikat. And the one that was on display, I hope it's no longer in display because it's really deteriorating under display. But the one on display had a wider ikat with very, with roms. It's a different cloth. It's a different cloth altogether. But because, as you know, and maybe many people in the audience might know, maybe they don't, right? That these are burial, we assume them to be burial textiles, they're associated with burials, but we know very little about their context, right? Whether they were wrapping bodies, where they were, we don't know. They're just fragments that we are associated with a set of both burials that have a very wide range of dating. So, but if again I want to be conservative, we could say that could they have been made right just before Spanish contact, right? Which is would be a later dating. Again, it would be reasonable. But for us, as you know, right, for us to be able to make proper statements that hold up over time, we really need like this a variety of information. I'm hoping one day that there would be enough non-destructive methodologies to be able to answer some of these questions, right? Or that if there would be any destructive technologies that we would use, it would have improved to such an extent that we would require less and less, as opposed to right. Right now, I believe it's like I don't know 2 grams, and when I did this isotope study and I contributed um, a deconstructed fabric from my own collection for one of the samples, I tell you, it broke my heart. Right? You're just taking apart a cloth,
Yes.
pulling out the white and removing the black. It's heartbreaking. And this wasn't even an heirloom cloth. It was a fairly commercial textile, but still so it's not for the faint-hearted. I would not
Yeah.
ask it
Exactly.
unless right museums say they have enough, right? And then yeah. I would love to actually hear from museums who would say, yes, we have enough and we would love to experiment and all that. But for the Banton, I would say that would be like the last stop, not to try to theorize around it um, and learn more so that we can actually say something really substantive. But it's a
Yes.
very important piece. It's and unfortunately, there are many in the world who won't take you seriously until you have absolute right
Evidence. Right.
dating, for example. But I've stopped worrying about those. You know, I, uh, with the advancements in research and technology, there are just so many different kinds of data sets now that can give us insights into things. So I'm not worried. Right, I used to just be worrying about carbon dating, but now I think that there are many ways to go about it.
Okay. Thank you, Cheree. We have more questions. It's coming now. So there's a question from an anonymous attendee, and he wanted to ask about how indigenous Abaca is being co-opted by industrial practices. So, according to her or him, he heard about informal talks that Abaca research is mainly done by machine engineers for making car seats, upholstery, etc. Is this correct? And how will this affect indigenous knowledge, indigenous copyright, and researchers' studies?
Okay, great. Thank you for that question. So, what's interesting about Abaca is that it's endemic to the Philippines, right? We now know it's endemic to Luzon. So the question of how it went to Mindanao and how it was adapted there is an interesting question altogether. But we're all very aware of the history of Abaca as an industrial fiber, right? In the early 20th century and even before. So it's not new. It's such a useful fiber because of its very special properties. So to say that um, industrial applications is some kind of co-opting of indigenous knowledge, I think that might not necessarily be true, right? I do know that we have a lot of within national borders, right? Knowledge about its uses. It's heavily researched by many government agencies, for example, but it's always had industrial use, even for Filipinos before the coming of Europeans, right? We used it in many, many ways. So cloth is just one of them, which shows right you might say our genius as a people, right? Because the abundance of Abaca meant that you could actually create so much, right? The beautiful things that you don't have to rely on imports. Meanwhile, we were also importing. We were very much part of the larger Southeast Asian maritime world, importing a lot of things that we desired, not just cloth, but industrial uses are not new. Now there are relatively new insights into industrial uses, especially since there's a desire for sustainable materials. So, for example, abaca has been used as a very useful substitute for fiberglass in the production of car bodies, for example, right? Because of its properties, right? And so I don't think that's a bad thing. That's a good thing because it is something that in a sense helps the world, right? And it is something that really speaks to the properties of the material itself, right? It's like saying, that the cotton is someone's intellectual property. I don't think so. I don't believe so. However, um, when they what does happen, and this has actually already happened, is that abaca production can actually be sent overseas. The Americans did it. They took abaca and they grew it in Costa Rica, for example, right? The Americans did that. That's why the Costa Rican varieties have all kinds of Maguindanao names, for example, right? They carried over many because they wanted to do right industrial farming, but of course, then white diseases came about, and so they kind of all were not viable. So it's always the challenges, various kinds of disease and industrial production. I guess the more important question would be how do we as a society try to produce abaca in ethical ways, right? So that in ways that they don't demean the life of the people who are dependent on it. I would say that would be a more interesting question. It's not only indigenous peoples that produce it, it's certainly also lots of non-indigenous peoples who produce it or participate in its production. So I hope I answered that question.
Okay, thank you. We'll take three more questions, Cheree. I know it's already 12 here, 10 to 12, but thank you for taking time to take on these questions. So there's another student designer. Her question is, she's currently interested in researching and experimenting with fibers on the digital loom to create novel fabrics or designs. Now that she've learned that ikat is shared by many regions or countries, and she's guessing doesn't belong to one particular culture, would it be considered as a form of cultural appropriation to just take the technique of tie-dyeing fibers in an experimental way? And what are the limitations in terms of creating liberty, if ever, with this production?
Okay, that's a great question too. So cultural appropriation, right, is a very big concern, right, amongst many of us. So I guess the question would be, what are you using it for? So cultural appropriation, I believe, occurs when one tries to present it as your own instead of, let's say, a borrowing, right? So if you are an artist, a textile artist, right, a fashion designer, or just a visual artist, and you want to be inspired by certain textiles, including ikat designs, right? I don't believe that we should be fearful of dipping into many sources of inspiration, but it's all about how we frame that and where that image or inspiration comes from, right? So I was recently at the exhibit of Pasita Abad here at the MoMA PS1 show, and I learned that cultural appropriation has been raised, right, with some of the things that she's done. But what I found instead amazing was that the textiles are a source of inspiration and creativity and bricolage for her, right? So walking in, I said, I recognize so many kinds of Philippine textiles that she was using essentially as semiotic markers, right, of different parts of the Philippines. And I don't think that's appropriation. Because she's not particularly coming where she's from Batanes, right? So, but she's using all of these textiles from all over the Philippines. I think it was for a larger message, right? That tells you that here is like, a bricolage of women's textile production from all over the country. So that's, I think, a very effective way of using it. Now, in what ways can we best kind of think about these things ethically? So I'll give you an example from my own experience, right? So we know that the textiles, the ikat patterns are when we interact with weavers in Mindanao, usually they would talk about them as coming from their dreams, for example, right? So hence the term dream weaver. But if you really think about it, if it really just comes from dreams, there should be a more random, broader, weirder distribution of patterns, but they're not. They're actually quite similar. There's a certain kind of constraint, right? So therefore, the dreaming is not necessarily free dreaming, but the dreaming is actually within the constraints of ikat motif grammar, shall we say, right? And so, but when a weaver claims that he or she, sorry, they're all women, have created a completely new design, right? That comes from their dreams. And you see, if you are someone who's familiar with them, that it's actually a very new design. What is your obligation? So this happened to me. So in the sense that Lang Dulay, the late Lang Dulay, right, said to me, oh, I came up with my own design, right? Because she would explain to me, oh, this is what that's called, that's what that called. I came up with my own. She showed it to me, right? And I go, oh, this is beautiful. Okay, what is my obligation, right, as a researcher? I'm not going to publish this image because it's her original design, right? I'll ask her family maybe or give it to the, I mean, I have an image, I see it, I recognize it, and I really see that there's a certain uniqueness to it that I haven't seen in others, right? So I just made that decision that I have it, but I'm not going to publish it because I believe that I don't want anybody to take it and put it on a cushion because it's her design, right? So that's one of those small decisions that I made because I just don't think it's ethical because she told me that it is hers. Now others which are in museums right now and they're all in the public domain, we have to understand that weavers copy from other weavers, right? In among the Iban in Indonesia, they actually pay the weaver whose cloth they copied from a fee. It's like intellectual property fee, right? And it's a sign that you're such a great weaver that your design is worth copying, right? So there is copying. They take the cloth itself and they study it, right? And then they try to copy. Are the copies exact? No, because that's the nature of the production. It will always vary a little bit. But the copy is helpful in counting, right? And planning the design itself. So there's always some kind of copying and referencing. So I guess for us, it's more like, you know, if you wish to be inspired by the kinds of ikat patterning that you find in the Philippine or even non-Philippine traditions, I guess the important thing is to really read, right, and educate yourself about what these designs mean, and to always keep scrupulous notes of right where you get them, right? To always, it's like the Creative Commons, right? I always attribute, and I think that that would be a worthwhile endeavor that will still allow us to be creative but also respectful.
Okay, thank you, Cheree. I have a lot of questions like the collective ownership. So if it's designed by the weaver, that's her design. But when up to what point does it become a collective ownership of the woven design or fabric?
You know, when we think of collective, I tend to believe that um, we look at it through the filters of that are not present in indigenous thinking, right? So
Mhm.
when we say it's collective in the sense that does a cloth only pass through several hands? Yes,
Yeah.
especially when they become garments. Definitely, lots of hands. Somebody will somebody will make the thread, somebody will tie the design, somebody else might weave, somebody will tailor it, somebody will embellish it. So in that sense, it's collective. There's no one single author, no, in a way. However, for really high value ikat cloth, I've noticed and realized that they actually have their own biographies, so much so that weavers have looked at the cloth and knew immediately who made it.
Mm.
And they would say to me, oh, that's from what's it, you know, she did that, and I remember because they were there when it was started. So there's this interesting kind of right memory, shared memory, but there was a clear attribution of who made it, for instance, right? And there was another instance, I've published this also. I was using a photograph to elicit a comment from a particular informant, and I wanted her to comment on the woman in the picture. It was one of the it was Sarah Metcalf, you know, surrounded by this pagoba in the Manila Carnival 1932. But instead, she was ignoring my question. Instead, she was talking about the outfit worn by one man. She goes, she goes, that pair of trousers, that was stolen from this family, made
Oh,
by so and so. Right. But it was made by so and so. So there actually is attributable authorship, except that it's not right. So the collective as we imagine it is not this, right? It's not faceless. It's actually embedded in relationships that are unfortunately, right, rather invisible to us. But to the ones who are responsible for making them, right, it is known. Now, what we do with that information, right, becomes the important question, right? How do we participate as ethical actors? Everybody now going into the indigenous communities, filming themselves, right? Posting online, themselves being filmed, interacting with indigenous peoples. Oh my God, right? Where is the ethical? You know, there are some ethical issues there, I believe, right? Unless you ask for ongoing consent, right? May I film you? Is it okay? Can we talk? Right? I mean, those are kinds of standard things that I think need to be addressed, right? Or even asking, may I film you, does not excuse you showing up out of the blue and interfering in their lives. So it's like those are kind of um, I guess adjacent questions to that issue.
Thank you, Cheree. So the last question is another one. Your presentation reminded me of a photo I took of an intricately cross-stitched blouse, yellow, red, white, black, worn by a young Mandaya girl. I don't have much information about it except that the tribal leader said it would take a day to talk about the stories related to the patterns or production. Would you have knowledge about these types of clothing?
Yes, embroidery on cotton cloth, upper garments, especially for women, but also sometimes for men, is actually less likely to die, shall we say, right? That's pretty active. You see it. Of course, it depends on having some kind of initial cash outlay because thread is expensive. It's purchased, right? In my field times, it was at NCCC in Davao City, right? You have to go and buy it there, and it's very, very expensive, as well as cloth itself. That's actually purchased. But yeah, Mandaya cross stitchery is very fine, very beautiful, similar to Tiboli cross stitchery, and it's usually found in women's upper garments. And what you find would be contemporary versions that have right named motifs. Manobo also engage in cross stitchery, and we can find that they have earlier versions in the museum record that make use of, let's say, Abaca thread on Abaca cloth, right? Because it's a
Wow.
very similar technology, right? It's needle and thread, so you just basically need needles and fiber. So it's another area that is for me exciting. uh Maybe one day somebody will do that, right? But
Let's do it.
yeah, it's one of those that are actually quite persistent, and there's
Yes,
a lot of creativity because you can do it during downtime,
right.
right? So it's and also educated indigenous peoples who might not have had the opportunity to learn really difficult things like dyeing, right? Or even weaving itself, although weaving is low skill compared to dyeing, or tying a pattern, can easily participate through embroidery, right? And these kinds of things. So that's actually um very, very much, visible. And again, some are better than others, right? But in answer to the question, has it been studied? Yes, there's several publications about that. Not new, but they've been around, right, in the 1990s, and I'm sure that they can still be discovered if you wish.
Okay, thank you, Cheree. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us here at the Corditex. And would like to end this question from or remark from Carlito Kamahala, who's Agusan Manobo in our audience right now. What would be your advice to textile scholars and researchers out there who's going to embark to this kind of endeavor?
Lito, hello. Lito's been in my house in Brooklyn. So it's nice to hear from you. Um, I think that um, it's just important to continue educating ourselves about cloth, reading widely. We have a tendency to read narrowly. We need to read widely. I'm only, and I've been at this for many decades. I've only been emerging from this kind of narrow inquiry after I say, okay, I'm doing Abaca and Ikat. Okay, what can I, if I step back, what can I do? So I stepped back during COVID and asked a larger question, which was color, the color red and the color black, and the world opened up. right? Suddenly there were all these different questions that emerge. So I think as textile scholars, we have to read widely, right? Whatever we can find out about. So right now I'm reading, as I told you, right, about Turkey red and about cotton. But there are all these people in our country have produced a lot of really, really important work. So I would always say, read Sandy Castro's book, right? About the history of cloth, Spanish era Philippines. It's a very nice thin book, Ateneo. That's a great book to read. I know that Shine Kanta hasn't published it yet, but she did research on Indian textile terms in the Philippines, right? So there's plenty there to mine, the history of India in the Philippines in terms of our textile production, right? But also, textile production today, right? There's so much going on worldwide. In Southeast Asia, we have a very, very long tradition of variety in textile use. We have enormous appetite for cloth, and all kinds of things we can do with it. And I think that that's a really interesting thing to be a textile scholar. So I know it sounds very general, but yeah, read, but follow your passions, right? Follow your questions, and educate yourself as much as you can about cloth traditions that are not necessarily just limited, right, to our country or to our specific local region, but in a broader sense.
All right. Thank you so much, Cheree. There's a comment from Ross Zerudo from, nasan ba si Ross Zerudo ngayon? Nasa US yata siya. So just a remark, I hope we make a major visual arts on this expertise in fashion or fine arts. And thank you very much for the very, very insightful talk, Cheree. And we've learned a lot from this one, and we hope to collaborate with you with Corditex. Marami itong nabuksan na Pandora box for areas of collaboration. So thank you so much, Cheree, and thank you for our audience. It's already 12:10 actually here in the Philippines. Thank you for staying with us despite the technological glitches earlier. So thank you, and please look forward to our next webinar also, and check our website. And we invite you to the World ICA Textile Symposium in December 3 to 6 at the Baguio Convention and Cultural Center. Hopefully, we'll have Cheree there to give a talk also as one of the symposium speakers. So thank you very much, Cheree, and thank you to our audience. Maraming
Maraming
salamat.
salamat din. Bye-bye. Good
Daghang
night.
salamat.
Good night from
Thank
here.
you. Good night. And good morning.
Bye.
Thank you,
Yes,
Cheree.
salamat din. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye. So thank you, everyone, and see you in our next webinar series, happening once a month, every Wednesdays, coming soon. Thank you and goodbye.